He invited his poor ex-wife to shame her. She arrived pregnant with billionaire, Rolls-Royce and twins. Stuart thought he was orchestrating her humiliation, but when those heavy doors opened, the bride's rival didn't look broken. She looked untouchable. Pregnant, radiant, and flanked by a billionaire husband and two perfect sons, she turned the very stage built to shame her into her ultimate triumph. What Stuart didn't realize was that by inviting his ex-wife to witness his victory, he had just summoned his own destruction. If you're ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe, like this video, and comment what time it is that you're watching this video. Now let's get back to the story. The organ swelled through the grand chamber of St. Giles Hall, each note a polished promise of perfection. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, scattering prisms across velvet seats and gilded panels. The scent of polished wood and roses clung to the air, heavy and ceremonial. Guests leaned forward, clutching their programs like keepsakes, murmuring softly about the union they were here to witness. The marriage of barrister Stuart Bowman to Clara Whitcomb, heir to the Whitcomb property empire. For weeks, Edinburgh's society columns had billed this as the wedding of the season, a union of ambition and wealth. To Stuart, it was more than matrimony. It was his ascension, a ladder rung secured with every vow. He stood at the altar in his sharply cut tuxedo, shoulders squared, chin set at just the right angle for the photographers. He had practiced that stance in the mirror, ensuring it struck the balance between confidence and humility. His dark hair gleamed under the light, his lips curved in the faintest smile. He looked like victory sculpted into a man. Beside him stood Clara, serene and stunning in a gown of lace and silk. Her beauty was icy, deliberate, every detail calculated to project elegance rather than warmth. She held her bouquet of white roses like a queen would a scepter. Clara was not the type to swoon or blush. She was here because Stuart's ambition matched her family's appetite for influence. Their union was a contract dressed as romance, and both knew it. But beneath Stuart's polished exterior stirred something restless, something unfinished. He could feel it gnawing at him even as the organ played. Keely. The memory of his first wife clung to him like smoke. He remembered her laughter echoing in their tiny Leith flat. The way she'd teased him about his obsession with starched collars, the nights they'd sat cross-legged on the floor eating takeaway curry because the kitchen table was too small. She had been warmth where Clara was frost, sincerity where Clara was strategy. And yet, Keely had not fit the future Stuart wanted. He had climbed over her, leaving her behind like an old suit that no longer served. The divorce had been swift, merciless. In Stuart's circles, she became a whisper, a reminder that ambition required sacrifice. And yet, when the gilded invitations were printed for his wedding to Clara, he had ensured one found its way to Keely. Not out of kindness, but cruelty. He wanted her there, seated in some dark corner, forced to watch him claim everything she could never be. He wanted to see her small. The organ's notes lingered in the air, and the guests shifted, sensing the ceremony's next cue. The great oak doors at the end of the hall groaned open, and Stuart straightened. His lips tightened in anticipation. But what entered was not the shame he had scripted. It was Keely. She stood framed in the doorway, her presence eclipsing everything else. Her gown was ivory silk, simple yet devastating in its elegance. Her dark skin glowed against the soft fabric, her hair cascading in waves that caught the light. In one hand, she cradled the fingers of a child. No, two children. Identical twins, dressed in miniature tuxedos, their blonde hair glinting like crowns. And at her side, tall and broad-shouldered, was Patrick McKee. His reputation preceded him. Billionaire, visionary, the man whose fintech empire had reshaped industries across 2 continents. His fortune rivaled dynasties. But more than wealth, Patrick carried an aura of command. When he entered a room, the room bent around him. And now, He stood beside Keely as though she were the only crown he needed. Outside, the silver Rolls-Royce Phantom idled, its presence a statement as clear as words. She had not come broken. She had come untouchable. The hall erupted into whispers. "My God, is that her? She looks magnificent. Those boys? Are they his? McKee? He came himself?" Stuart's chest tightened. His grip on Clara's hand faltered for the briefest second, though he forced it steady again. This was not possible. This was not how it was supposed to go. Keely met his gaze across the expanse of the hall. Her eyes were calm, unreadable, yet there was something there, something that said she no longer owed him anything, that she had risen beyond his reach. Patrick's hand rested lightly at the small of her back, a gesture protective yet reverent. He bent to whisper something in her ear, and Keely smiled. A smile that sliced through Stuart more sharply than any courtroom loss. Clara shifted beside him, her knuckles whitening against the bouquet. She could feel the current in the room turn, the weight of attention shift. Guests no longer leaned forward for her entrance. They craned their necks for Keely's. Photographers forgot the bride and groom, their lenses snapping furiously at the doorway. Keely stepped onto the crimson carpet, her twins walking proudly at her sides. She moved with the poise of someone who no longer feared judgment. Each step echoed with defiance, though she never raised her chin arrogantly. She simply walked as though she belonged, and the world rearranged itself to agree. The organist faltered, hands slipping as if struck by the sight. A note rang out discordant, but no one cared. Stuart's heart hammered. He had summoned her to witness his triumph, but it was she who arrived triumphant, she who owned the room. He leaned slightly toward Clara, whispering harshly, "Ignore them. Focus." But Clara's lips pressed thin. She was not used to being overshadowed. She had expected to be the radiant centerpiece of this day, not eclipsed by a woman her groom once discarded. Keely's twins, sensing the stares, clutched tighter at her hands. One looked up at Patrick, who bent down, murmuring encouragement. The boy smiled, reassured. That image, Patrick as father, Keely as mother, the family they presented, etched itself into every guest's mind like a tableau. And in that tableau, Stuart looked suddenly small. The whispers grew bolder. Bowman invited her? Foolish. She's more radiant than the bride. Imagine, married to McKee now. She's won. Stuart's smile faltered, his carefully rehearsed mask slipping at the edges. For the first time that day, he felt exposed, naked. Keely reached her seat near the front, Patrick easing the boys beside her. She sat with quiet dignity, her hand resting protectively over her belly. She did not glance at Stuart again. She didn't need to. Her very presence was enough. The officiant cleared his throat, trying to gather the ceremony back into order. The organ resumed, hesitant, but steady. Clara's grip on Stuart's arm was rigid, her composure cracking under the weight of Keely's entrance. But Stuart's mind was elsewhere, spinning. This was not just an interruption. It was a humiliation, a public unraveling of his carefully crafted image. He had built this day as a monument to victory, and instead it had become a stage for Keely's redemption. He clenched his jaw, vowing silently, this was not over. Yet deep down, in a corner of himself, he would never admit. Stuart knew the truth. He had invited her to shame her, and instead, he had summoned his reckoning. The vows would continue. The ceremony would proceed. The rings would be exchanged. But nothing in the eyes of Edinburgh's society would ever erase the moment Keely walked through those doors and reclaimed her dignity before them all. And for the first time in years, Stuart Bowman was afraid. The applause had long faded, the whispers of her dramatic entrance still echoing in Stuart's skull. But for Keely, the weight of that moment in St. Giles Hall was more than spectacle. It was vindication. 1,000 nights of loneliness, of whispered doubts, of staring at ceilings, wondering why life had broken her, all condensed into a single step across that crimson carpet. But triumphs are only sweet when one remembers the ashes they rose from. After the divorce in late 2019, Keely's world narrowed. Gone was the shared flat with Stuart, its cramped walls and cluttered bookshelf where she once scribbled notes during his early court cases. She moved into a one-bedroom in Bruntsfield, its linoleum floors peeling at the edges, the smell of damp rising from the old carpet. She worked double shifts at the Royal Infirmary, her nurses' scrubs clinging to her as she slogged home past midnight, only to sleep for 3 hours before returning again. Christmas that year was a plastic tree from Tesco, standing lopsided by her window. She'd strung fairy lights around it, sipping cheap mulled wine, while outside fireworks rang in a new year that felt like punishment more than promise. "Cheer up, Key," her colleague Rona had urged one night in January 2020, handing her a lukewarm coffee during a break. "The man wasn't worth it. He's just another suit who thought ambition was sexier than loyalty." Keely had forced a laugh, but her eyes stung. Stuart wasn't just a suit. He had been her world once. He had been her partner when their bank balance barely survived, when they'd argued over whether to splurge on heating or groceries. To watch him trade her in for someone like Clara, polished, pedigreed, was a wound that wouldn't clot. The pandemic of 2020 only deepened her isolation. Hospitals overflowed, nurses broke under the strain, and Keely became a ghost haunting the wards. She rarely ate more than toast. Her hands cracked from sanitizer, her body ached, her mind numbed. By 2021, she'd quit. Not out of choice, but survival. She told herself she'd take a break, but days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Her savings drained. The heating bills piled up. She picked up shifts at a cafe in Marchmont, serving lattes to students whose laughter made her feel ancient. She was 31, but felt 50. Nights stretched long and empty. Then came the evening of December 15th, 2021. She was on the number 11 bus, heading home after a 12-hour shift at the cafe. Snow pressed against the windows, streetlights blurred by frost. The bus smelled of damp coats and exhaustion. She'd skipped dinner again, too tired to care. Halfway up the hill, her vision swam. Her heart thudded, her breath caught, and suddenly the world tilted. "Keely? Miss, are you all right?" someone asked, their voice muffled as though underwater. She fainted before she could answer. When she woke, she was in a hospital bed. The steady beep of a monitor beside her. A young doctor with tired eyes explained gently, dehydration, exhaustion, and an early miscarriage. The words sank into her like a stone. She hadn't even known she was pregnant. She stared at the ceiling tiles, numb. The child she hadn't known she carried was gone, and with it, any remnants of hope. She whispered into the sterile air, "The world forgot me." For weeks after, she drifted. She stopped answering calls, ignored texts from Rona, and rarely left the flat. Depression clung to her like a shadow. She thought often of Stuart, not because she missed him, but because she couldn't escape the comparison. He was rising, society dinners, legal victories, photographs in the Scotsman, while she was falling. It was Rona who pulled her out, in her own stubborn way. "You're coming to the Balmoral Gala with me," Rona insisted in March 2022, barging into Keely's flat with a spare dress. "I don't care if you sulk in the corner, you're not rotting here. Wash your hair, put this on, and remember you're still alive." Keely had resisted, but somehow, 2 hours later, she was standing in the glittering ballroom of the Balmoral Hotel, the chandeliers scattering light across marble floors. She felt like an imposter in borrowed heels. The crowd was thick with men in tuxedos and women in gowns that whispered wealth. She hovered near the champagne table, clutching a glass like a lifeline. That's when she spilled it. She'd turned suddenly, colliding with a man carrying a tray of hors d'oeuvres. The champagne sloshed, cascading down the sleeve of a navy tuxedo. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," Keely stammered, fumbling for napkins. The man chuckled, kneeling slightly as he dabbed at his own sleeve. His accent was Irish, his voice deep, with a warmth that startled her. "Best way to meet someone is over a shared disaster. Isn't it?" She looked up and met Patrick McKee. Photographs never did him justice. His presence was magnetic, his smile disarming. For a moment, Keely forgot to breathe. I really am sorry," she murmured, cheeks burning. "Don't be," he said, his eyes twinkling. "I was due for a wardrobe change anyway. I'm Patrick." He extended his hand, damp napkin and all. "Keely," she replied, hesitating before shaking it. From that moment, the air shifted. They talked for an hour by the champagne table, about everything and nothing. He told her about his work in fintech mergers, his frustrations with bureaucracy, his hopes for philanthropy. She told him about nursing, about burnout, about the small cafe she worked at now. Unlike others, he didn't pity her. He listened. He laughed at her dry jokes. By the end of the night, he asked, "Would you let me call you sometime? Perhaps for coffee? No champagne involved, I promise." She almost said no. She almost retreated into the safe cocoon of loneliness. But something in his eyes, the way they held hers, steady, patient, made her whisper, "All right." Their first date was coffee at a tucked-away shop on Rose Street. He arrived early, no entourage, no flash. Just Patrick, in a simple coat, grinning when she walked in. He listened more than he spoke, asked about her favorite books, her childhood holidays, her dreams before nursing. By the time she left, her chest felt lighter. Weeks passed. Walks through Prince's Street Gardens. Dinners at quiet restaurants where he insisted on splitting dessert. Conversations that stretched until dawn. For the first time in years, Keely felt seen. In August 2022, a photograph surfaced in the Edinburgh Evening News. Patrick McKee, billionaire, strolling hand in hand with a mystery woman through the gardens. Keely's heart raced when Rona texted her the link with 20 exclamation points. By December, there was no hiding it. They were inseparable. He introduced her to his colleagues, to his sister, to his world, not as a secret, but as his partner. "Key," he told her one night, sitting on her couch with takeaway cartons between them. "You never once asked about my money. Do you know how rare that is?" She shrugged, embarrassed. "I didn't want your money, just your company." "That," he said softly, kissing her forehead, "is why I want to give you both." For the first time since the ashes of 2019, Keely felt hope. A year later, on a warm June afternoon in 2023, she told him she was pregnant. Twins. His face lit up, his laughter booming as he lifted her off her feet. "Twins! Keely, we're going to need a bigger house!" The news spread quickly. Dublin's society pages buzzed, and in Edinburgh, whispers grew louder. The ex-wife of Stuart Bowman, once forgotten, was now the future wife of Patrick McKee, and carrying his heirs. By August, on the cliffs of Howth, overlooking the Irish Sea, Patrick dropped to one knee, a sapphire ring gleaming in the sun. Keely's tears blurred the horizon as she said yes, and as photographers captured her hand, raised in joy, Edinburgh's elite began to murmur with unease. Because in October, Stuart Bowman's wedding was set to take place, and Keely's name was no longer a whisper. It was a storm on the horizon. Keely sat on the balcony of Patrick's Georgian townhouse in Dublin, her hands folded gently over the swell of her belly. It was early September 2023, the air crisp with the first bite of autumn. Below, the River Liffey glimmered in the morning light, alive with boats ferrying commuters across the city. Patrick was inside, pacing in the kitchen, phone pressed to his ear as he conducted yet another transatlantic call. She could hear his laugh, deep and rich, cutting through the professional tone of his conversation. It never ceased to amaze her that a man who held the financial futures of entire companies in his hands could still sound boyish when he laughed. Keely closed her eyes, listening, and let herself smile. The twins, only a few months from being born, stirred inside her, small reminders that life was moving forward, whether she was ready or not. A sharp ping interrupted her reverie. She glanced at her phone. The email subject line froze her in place. With warm regards, Stuart Bowman and Clara Whitcomb. Her thumb hesitated before tapping it open. The email was not personal, but formal, stamped with an ornate gold crest. Mr. and Mrs. Charles Whitcomb, together with the Bowman family, request the honor of your presence at the marriage of Stuart Allen Bowman to Clara Margaret Whitcomb on the 14th of October 2023 at St. Giles Hall, Edinburgh. Keely's stomach lurched. For a moment she thought it was morning sickness, but no, it was sharper, colder. Patrick stepped out, slipping his phone into his pocket. "Everything all right, love?" She held the phone out to him. He read the email, his brow furrowing. A beat of silence, then he snorted, shaking his head. The audacity of the man. Keely managed a weak laugh. "He probably thought I'd never show." "He invited you to humiliate you," Patrick said flatly, "to parade his wealth, his new bride, and watch you squirm." He crouched down beside her, his hand covering hers on her stomach. "But Keely, you don't have to go. You owe him nothing." Her throat tightened. She wanted to say no. She wanted to delete the email and never think of it again. But another part of her, deep and stubborn, whispered differently. "I don't want revenge," she murmured, "but I don't want to hide either." Patrick studied her, his eyes warm, steady. "Then we'll go. Not to play his game, but to live our truth. You'll walk in there as who you are now, not who you were then. And trust me, he won't be the one who wins that day." Keely felt her chest loosen, just slightly. Patrick always had that way of reframing the world until she could breathe again. Still, that night as she lay in bed, the invitation burned in her mind. She saw Stuart's face, smug and polished, imagined the whispers of guests, the sting of pitying glances. Her nightmares pulled her back to the flat in Bruntsfield, the damp carpet under her feet, the sound of Stuart's laughter with Clara bleeding through her phone screen. But each time she startled awake, Patrick was there, pulling her close, reminding her of the present. "You're not that woman anymore, Key. You're mine. You're theirs." He pressed a hand over her stomach, where the twins kicked as if in agreement. Meanwhile, in Edinburgh, Stuart nursed a brandy in the dim glow of his gentleman's club. The fire crackled, painting shadows across leather chairs and mahogany shelves. Opposite him sat his closest confidant, Charles Henshaw, a fellow barrister who had known him since university. "You actually invited her?" Charles asked, disbelief flickering across his face. "Of course," Stuart said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "What better way to show I've moved on? To show her what she lost?" Charles frowned. "Or what better way to stir trouble? Keely may not be the same woman you divorced." Stuart scoffed. "Please. She's probably still pouring lattes somewhere. She'll come, desperate to be noticed, and everyone will see the gulf between us. It'll put the last nail in that coffin." But doubt lingered beneath his bravado. He hadn't kept close tabs on Keely, but now and then whispers had reached him. Photographs in Dublin papers, mentions of Patrick McKee's mystery companion. Each time he dismissed them. Surely she couldn't have landed so high, not after falling so low. Surely fate wasn't so cruel. Still, he tightened his grip on the brandy glass. Charles leaned back, exhaling. "You've always been ambitious, Stuart, but sometimes ambition blinds a man to common sense. Ambition is what separates us from the ordinary, Stuart retorted. Keely was ordinary. Clara is extraordinary. And when the city sees us wed, no one will question that. As September waned into October, Keely prepared quietly. Patrick insisted on the best, a gown designed in Paris, tailored to her pregnant frame, miniature tuxedos for the twins, each fitted with red bow ties, a chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce Phantom to carry them through the cobbled streets of Edinburgh. Keely resisted at first. "It's too much, Patrick. People will think we're showing off." He kissed her cheek, smiling. "We're not showing off. We're showing up. There's a difference." Her days became a whirlwind of fittings, doctor appointments, and soft moments with Patrick. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Keely confessed, "I'm afraid." "Of what?" he asked, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. "Of walking in there and reverting, feeling small again, like I did when I first signed those divorce papers. Like I was nothing." Patrick took her hand, pressing it against his chest. "Key, you'll never be nothing. You're the mother of my children, the woman I want beside me until my last breath. And if those people can't see your worth, that says everything about them and nothing about you." Tears pricked her eyes. "You always know what to say." "It's not words," he whispered. "It's truth." In Edinburgh, the wedding rehearsals carried on with precision. Clara was meticulous, overseeing every detail. She demanded perfection, flowers flown in from Holland, a lace veil commissioned from Milan, a string quartet tuned to her liking. But even she sensed Stuart's distraction. One night, as they stood in the cavernous hall rehearsing the procession, she caught him staring at the grand doors. "Who are you waiting for?" she asked softly, suspicion threading her voice. "No one," he replied quickly, too quickly. Her eyes narrowed. "You sent her an invitation, didn't you?" He froze. "Stuart," Clara said, her voice sharp now. "Tell me you didn't." He swallowed. "It was harmless. She won't come." Clara's jaw tightened. She knew enough of Keely's story to understand the danger. And though she would never admit it, the thought of being overshadowed, even for a moment, gnawed at her. If Keely came, Clara would not forgive him. On the evening of October 13th, Keely stood before the mirror in the Dublin townhouse, her gown laid across the bed. Patrick stood behind her, adjusting his cufflinks. The twins slept in the next room, their tiny tuxedos hanging ready. "Are you ready?" he asked. Keely met her own reflection. The woman staring back was not the same one who had fainted on a bus 2 years earlier. She was older, wiser, carrying new life within her. Her scars had not disappeared, but they had hardened into armor. "Yes," she said finally. "I'm ready." And though she whispered it to the mirror, she felt as if she were saying it to the world. Because tomorrow, the 14th of October 2023, the doors of St. Giles would open, and fate would no longer write her story. She would. The morning of October 14th, 2023, dawned cool and sharp, the kind of Edinburgh morning that seemed carved from slate. Mist clung to the Firth of Forth, rolling inland like a pale tide, while the cobblestones of the Royal Mile gleamed slick from an overnight rain. Inside St. Giles Hall, preparations buzzed like a hive. Florists trimmed final stems, waiters adjusted table settings for the reception, and photographers circled like hawks, their lenses already trained on the aisle. To the city, this was the marriage of the season. Stuart Bowman, the rising star barrister, to Clara Whitcomb, daughter of one of Scotland's most powerful families. To Stuart, it was something more. It was vindication, the day he would prove to Edinburgh, and perhaps to himself, that he had risen far beyond his humble beginnings. He stood in the side chamber, buttoning his cuffs with practiced precision. His reflection stared back from the gilt mirror. The perfect groom, Dark hair combed immaculately, tuxedo cut to perfection, jaw clenched just tightly enough to look determined. He looked, by all accounts, like a man who had won. But behind that reflection, a thought gnawed. Keely. The invitation had been sent, but no reply had ever come. Stuart had told himself she wouldn't dare appear, that she would stay tucked away in some quiet corner of Dublin, too ashamed to face him. And yet, as he adjusted his tie, he found himself glancing at the grand doors in his mind's eye. What if she came? He shoved the thought aside, forcing his attention back to Clara. She was radiant this morning, her veil draped elegantly over her shoulders, her lace gown hugging every curve with calculated grace. She had chosen a bouquet of roses so white they seemed almost silver. She looked the part of a bride destined for magazine covers. And yet, beneath her flawless surface, Stuart could sense the tension. Clara had not forgiven him for sending that invitation. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice clipped as she adjusted her gloves. "Always," Stuart said smoothly. But his hands betrayed him. They trembled just slightly as he picked up his boutonniere. Across the city, Keely stood in front of a mirror of her own. In the suite of the Balmoral Hotel, the ivory gown hugged her figure, the silk flowing down in effortless lines. Her hair had been styled in soft waves, her skin glowing against the pale fabric. Her twins, Oliver and James, sat cross-legged on the carpet, fidgeting in their miniature tuxedos. James tugged at his bow tie, scowling. "Mummy, it's itchy." Keely knelt, smoothing the fabric. "That's because you're handsome. Handsome men have to make sacrifices." Oliver giggled, and James rolled his eyes but stood still long enough for her to adjust it. Patrick entered then, already dressed, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, and for a moment his expression softened, as though he were seeing her for the first time all over again. "You look—" He shook his head, almost laughing. "Key, you look like you were born for this moment." She felt her throat tighten, but she smiled. "I don't know if I was born for it, but I'm walking into it." He crossed the room, taking her hands. "Remember, today is not about him. It's about you. About us. Whatever they whisper, whatever they think, you owe none of them your shame." She nodded, letting his words anchor her. Still, her pulse fluttered in her throat. She wasn't here to gloat. She wasn't here to wound. She was here to stand, simply and firmly, as herself. The Rolls-Royce Phantom waited outside, polished to a mirror shine. When Keely, Patrick, and the twins descended, cameras already flashed, reporters calling out her name. "Keely, over here! Is it true you're expecting twins? Keely, how do you feel about Stuart's wedding?" She shielded the boys gently with her arm, slipping into the car. The door closed and the noise fell away, replaced by the quiet hum of the engine. Patrick squeezed her hand. "You ready?" he asked. "As I'll ever be," she whispered. At St. Giles, the pews filled with Edinburgh's elite, judges, MPs, property magnates, and society wives dripping with pearls. Their whispers filled the hall like a tide. "Clara looks divine, doesn't she? Stuart will be in Parliament by next year, mark my words. A perfect match, wealth and ambition." The organ swelled. The officiant cleared his throat. Stuart took his place at the altar, Clara on his arm. For a fleeting moment, everything seemed to align exactly as he had envisioned. Guests leaned forward, eager, expectant. Then the oak doors groaned. A hush swept through the hall. Heads turned, and the moment the doors opened, history shifted. Keely stood there, framed in the light. Her gown whispered elegance, the ivory fabric glowing against her skin. Her hand clutched the small fingers of Oliver and James, each boy's blonde hair catching the light like halos. Her other hand rested protectively on her rounded belly, and beside her, towering and steady, was Patrick McKee. the billionaire whose very presence turned whispers into gasps. The Rolls-Royce gleamed outside, its chrome grille shining like a beacon. Behind them, photographers surged forward, shutters clicking in rapid fire. Gasps rippled through the pews. "Is that Keely? With McKee? Impossible. Look at the children. Are they his? She's pregnant. Oh, Lord." Stuart froze, his smile faltering. He had wanted this moment. Yes, but not like this. He had expected her to arrive small, fragile, a shadow of herself. Instead, she walked in like royalty, her every step rewriting the script he had written. Clara stiffened beside him, her bouquet trembling in her grip. For the first time in her life, she was not the center of attention. She was background, a supporting act. Keely's gaze met Stuart's across the expanse. For a heartbeat, the world fell silent. There was no triumph in her eyes, no gloating, only calm, as though she had nothing left to prove. Patrick bent, murmuring something in her ear. Keely smiled faintly, her hand tightening on his. The twins marched proudly at her sides, their tiny bow ties gleaming. The organ faltered, the notes clashing awkwardly. Photographers shouted, their voices echoing through the vaulted chamber. And with every eye upon her, Keely stepped onto the crimson carpet. Stuart's world tilted. His chest tightened, his thoughts racing. This was not how it was supposed to go. This was his stage, his triumph. And yet, in one devastating moment, Keely had stolen it all, not by design, but by presence. Charles Henshaw, seated near the front, leaned toward another guest, his whisper carrying, "He's finished. The fool invited her, and she's bested him without a word." Stuart's jaw clenched. Clara's nails dug into his arm. The officiant shuffled awkwardly, waiting for the chaos to subside. And in that tension, between the vows that waited and the storm that had entered, the first cracks appeared. For all his ambition, for all his careful planning, Stuart Bowman had underestimated the one thing ambition could never erase: dignity reborn. And as Keely moved closer step by step, he realized the truth. He had not invited her to shame her. He had invited her to destroy himself. The organ regained its rhythm, though the falter lingered in the air like a bruise. The officiant, cheeks pink with strain, cleared his throat and announced the opening words of the ceremony. Yet even his voice could not draw the attention back to where it was meant to be, on the bride and groom. Because every eye, every whisper, every hurried glance flickered to the pew where Keely now sat, Patrick at her side, and the twins nestled between them. The boys swung their legs, restless and innocent, tugging occasionally at Patrick's sleeve. Keely smoothed their hair, whispered reassurances, and smiled with the softness of a woman who had no need to prove herself to anyone. It was that ease, that serenity, that set her apart. She did not storm the hall, nor gloat, nor demand attention. She simply was, and that was enough to command it. Stuart felt it like a noose tightening around his throat. At the altar, his hands trembled slightly as he clasped Clara's bouquet for her while she adjusted her veil. He leaned in, whispering, "Ignore her. Look at me." Clara didn't look at him. Her gaze was locked across the aisle, where Keely sat radiant in ivory, her presence eclipsing Clara's meticulously orchestrated perfection. A flicker of insecurity crossed Clara's face, an expression none of her society friends had likely ever witnessed. "She's ruining it," Clara muttered, her voice low but edged like glass. "She won't," Stuart insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. But Clara's hands shook as she returned her bouquet to his grip. The petals bent under her tension, a small betrayal of the composure she fought to maintain. The officiant pressed on, voice echoing through the vaulted chamber. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." The words blurred for Stuart. He heard them as though from underwater, his mind fixed on the ripple of whispers behind him. McKee looks utterly devoted to her. She carries herself like a queen. Imagine, Bowman thought he'd embarrass her, and she's the one with the billionaire. Every sentence seared into his ears, branding him a fool. Clara recited her vows first, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. She spoke of loyalty, of ambition, of walking beside Stuart as he ascended to his rightful place in society. Her words were sharp, precise, more like a contract than a promise of love. When it was Stuart's turn, his voice cracked. He spoke of destiny, of unity, of the future they would build together. Yet even as he spoke, his eyes betrayed him, flicking, just once, just briefly, toward Keely. And Keely saw it. She didn't flinch. She didn't gloat. She simply lowered her gaze, brushing her fingers across her stomach, as though reminding herself where her true vows already lay, with the life growing within her, with the man who held her hand through the fire. Clara noticed. The tiny betrayal was not lost on her. Her lips tightened, the corners of her mouth rigid as the officiant asked for the rings. The best man stepped forward, fumbling slightly with the velvet box. Stuart took Clara's ring first, sliding it onto her finger with hands that were suddenly damp. Then Clara, her hand trembling, slipped the gold band onto Stuart's finger. The circle closed, and with it, the finality of their union. Yet the hall was restless. Guests shifted, some leaning close to whisper again, others sneaking glances toward Keely, who sat serene as though carved into the pew. The officiant raised his hands. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Applause erupted, but it was muted, scattered, as though half the room clapped out of obligation while their eyes remained fixed elsewhere. The cameras clicked, but many lenses tilted, not toward the kiss Stuart pressed stiffly to Clara's lips, but toward the ex-wife in ivory, the billionaire at her side, and the twins wriggling between them. For Stuart, it was suffocating. He had orchestrated this day as his triumph, his crowning jewel. Instead, every applause felt like pity, every photograph like mockery. He stole a glance again, desperate to see Keely falter, to see some sign of discomfort. But Keely only smiled softly as Oliver tugged at her sleeve, asking for a sweet. Patrick bent down, pulling a wrapped caramel from his pocket, and handed it to the boy with a wink. The child's laughter rippled through the hall, innocent and pure. It was a sound Keely's life had once lacked, and now she carried it like music. That sound cut through Stuart more than any jeer could. The recessional began. Clara and Stuart walked arm in arm down the aisle, photographers clamoring, flashes exploding like lightning. Guests tossed petals into the air, but many turned their cameras, not to the bride and groom, but to the pew where Keely stood, gathering her sons and stepping into the aisle beside Patrick. The two processions intersected, a choreography fate itself seemed to have written. Clara's veil brushed past Keely's shoulder, and for a heartbeat the two women stood almost face to face. Clara's eyes burned, sharp and unyielding, but Keely's gaze was calm, steady, almost kind. She didn't need to say a word. The silence itself screamed louder than any insult. Patrick's hand tightened at Keely's back. Stuart's jaw flexed, his eyes darting to the ground. Clara tugged him forward, her lips pressed into a smile that looked carved, not lived. And in that fleeting intersection, the truth was laid bare. One woman had fought tooth and nail for dignity and found it. The other had acquired everything and still felt it slipping. Outside, the Rolls-Royce Phantom gleamed under the weak October sun. Crowds had gathered, reporters jostling for space, their questions overlapping in a cacophony. "Keely, how does it feel seeing your ex-husband remarried?" "Patrick, are you and Keely expecting twins?" "Mrs. McKee, is this your official debut in Edinburgh society?" Keely shielded her boys again, refusing to let them be overwhelmed. Patrick stepped in front, his presence commanding silence from even the boldest photographers. "No questions," he said firmly, his voice calm but absolute. The crowd hushed, almost cowed. Stuart and Clara emerged moments later. Showered with rose petals, yet the cheers felt muted, scattered by the murmurs still surrounding Keely's arrival. For every camera pointed at the newlyweds, two turned back toward the Rolls-Royce, where Keely and Patrick now stood as though carved from marble and light. The humiliation landed like a stone in Stuart's gut. This was his day, his script. Yet somehow Keely had stolen every headline without uttering a word. Clara sensed it too. She clutched Stuart's hand so tightly his knuckles whitened, her smile frozen, her fury simmering beneath. She would never forgive him for this, inviting the ghost of his past only to watch her eclipse the bride herself. That night, newspapers went to press. By dawn, the headlines were merciless. From nurse to billionaire's muse, Keely McKee stuns at Edinburgh wedding, Bowman's big day overshadowed by ex-wife's triumphant return. Society's survivor, Keely's radiance steals spotlight from bride. Stuart read them in silence, the brandy untouched at his side. Clara stormed into the room, the papers clutched in her hands. "You've humiliated us," she hissed. "Humiliated me." "Do you have any idea what people are saying?" Stuart didn't answer. His gaze lingered on a photograph. Keely stepping from the Rolls-Royce, Patrick's hand at her back, the twins clinging to her sides. She looked untouchable, unreachable, and for the first time, Stuart understood what true loss looked like. Not the loss of a marriage, not the loss of status, but the loss of dignity and the realization that once surrendered, it could never be reclaimed. Keely, meanwhile, tucked her sons into bed in the quiet of the Balmoral suite. Patrick drew the curtains closed, muting the city's noise. Keely kissed Oliver's forehead, then James's, her heart swelling as they drifted into sleep. She stood by the window, gazing out at the city lights. "Do you think we should have gone?" she asked softly. Patrick wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "I think you needed to. Not for him, not for them. For you." She leaned into him, her hand resting on his. "Then I'm glad I did." And in that quiet moment, the noise of the world fell away. For Keely, there was no more proving, no more pleading. She had walked into the lion's den, and she had walked out whole. The rest was simply life, waiting to be lived. The morning after the wedding, Edinburgh awoke not to the triumphant headlines Stuart had envisioned, but to a storm of photographs splashed across front pages and social media feeds. The Scotsman ran the cruelest line. "Bowman's day stolen, ex-wife, Keely McKee dazzles with billionaire husband." Inside, the spread told the story in merciless detail. Keely stepping from the Rolls-Royce, radiant in ivory, her hand resting on her belly, Patrick's protective stance at her side, the twins waving innocently at photographers. The image of Stuart and Clara kissing beneath a shower of rose petals sat awkwardly beneath it, smaller, diminished, as though the editors themselves could not quite believe who the story truly belonged to. On Twitter, a photo trended globally. Keely brushing James's hair back as Patrick bent to whisper in her ear. Someone had captioned it, "The picture of dignity. She didn't say a word, and still she won." By noon, the memes began. Someone edited Clara out of her wedding photo entirely, replacing her with Keely at the door of the hall. Another captioned Stuart's nervous glance toward Keely during the vows. "When your past looks better than your present." Stuart sat in his townhouse study, the papers spread before him, brandy untouched. His phone buzzed relentlessly, calls from colleagues, from his mother, from Clara's father. He ignored them all. His eyes were fixed on the photographs, on Keely's calm smile, on the children who looked so natural at her side. Clara burst in, her cheeks flushed, her eyes wild. She held up her phone, shaking it. "Do you see this? Do you see what they're saying about us?" Stuart rubbed his temples. "Ignore it. It will pass." "Pass?" Clara's voice cracked like a whip. "You've made me a laughingstock. My family a laughingstock. They don't care that we married. They care that she showed up looking like a queen. And it's because of you. You invited her." Stuart rose, his own temper flaring. "I invited her to show the difference between us, to show she had lost and I had won." "Well, congratulations," Clara snapped. "Now the world believes she's the one who won." The silence that followed was venomous. Clara's hands trembled as she set her phone down. "My father asked me this morning if you're still fit to pursue Parliament. If you can't control a wedding, how can you control a constituency? Do you know what that means? Do you?" Stuart's stomach twisted. He had wanted the wedding to be his launch pad into politics. Now, it was a millstone around his neck. Clara's voice dropped, cold and final. "You've ruined me, Stuart. You've ruined us." And with that, she left him standing alone in the study, the sound of the door slamming reverberating through the house like judgment. Meanwhile, at the Balmoral Hotel, Keely woke to the soft giggles of Oliver and James as they clambered onto her bed. Sunlight poured through the curtains, gilding their hair in gold. She laughed, pulling them close, inhaling the warm, sweet scent of their skin. Patrick entered carrying a tray of breakfast, toast, fruit, and a steaming pot of tea. "The press are still camped outside," he said, setting the tray on the table. "But we'll slip out through the back later. The hotel's discreet." Keely sighed, leaning against the pillows. "I didn't want this, Patrick. I didn't want attention. I only wanted to walk in there with my head held high. And now it feels like I'm part of some circus." Patrick sat on the edge of the bed, brushing his hand over her curls. "You didn't create the circus. Stuart did. All you did was show up. The rest was inevitable." She met his eyes. "Does it bother you, being dragged into his mess?" He smiled faintly, kissing her forehead. "Key, I've faced bigger storms than gossip. Let them talk. What matters is us. You, me, the boys, and the little ones still on the way. That's our truth." Her heart softened. She glanced at Oliver, who was trying to balance a grape on his nose, and at James, who was meticulously tearing his toast into neat squares. Their laughter filled the suite, innocent and untouched by the noise outside. Keely whispered, "For the first time in years I feel free." But freedom was not what Stuart felt. In the days that followed, whispers turned to questions, and questions turned to doubts. At his chambers, colleagues greeted him stiffly, their politeness edged with curiosity. Clients began hesitating, wary of being tied to a man whose name had become synonymous with scandal. One evening, Charles Henshaw cornered him in the library. "Stuart, you need to address this. Issue a statement. Something." Stuart bristled. "Address what? That my ex-wife married up? That she embarrassed me on my wedding day?" "Not embarrassed you," Charles said quietly. "Outshone you. There's a difference. And the public noticed." Stuart's fists clenched. This will pass. They'll forget. But deep down, he knew Charles was right. Clara, meanwhile, spiraled. She scrutinized every headline, every photo, every cruel comment online. She stopped attending luncheons, stopped answering calls, shut herself away in her dressing room for hours. When she did speak to Stuart, it was in sharp barbs. "You're obsessed with her," she accused one night, slamming her jewelry box shut. "You couldn't let her go, even on our day, and now she'll haunt us forever." Stuart wanted to deny it, but he couldn't. Keely did haunt him, not because he still loved her, but because her presence exposed the hollowness of what he'd built. Across the sea in Dublin, Keely's life blossomed quietly. She and Patrick spent afternoons strolling the gardens, evenings reading to the twins, and late nights planning the nursery for their unborn children. One evening, as they painted the nursery walls a soft cream, Keely paused, brush in hand. "Do you ever think," she asked, "that if I hadn't spilled that champagne, none of this would have happened?" Patrick chuckled, dipping his brush. "Fate has funny ways. I like to think it was always meant to be, you and me, colliding over a clumsy glass of champagne." Keely smiled, her chest warm. "It still feels surreal. That after everything, after the divorce, the loneliness, the miscarriage, I get this." She gestured to the room, to Patrick, to the muffled laughter of the boys playing in the hall. Patrick kissed the back of her hand, paint smudging his cheek. "You earned it. Don't ever think you didn't." Her eyes softened. "I don't feel like I earned it. I feel like I survived it." "And that," Patrick said firmly, "is the same thing." Back in Edinburgh, the Bowman household grew colder by the day. Stuart and Clara shared rooms, but not words. The Whitcomb family began to distance themselves quietly, their phone calls shorter, their invitations fewer. At a private dinner weeks later, Clara's father finally voiced what Stuart had feared. "Your judgment is in question, Stuart. If you couldn't foresee the consequences of inviting her, how can I trust you to foresee anything in politics? My daughter's reputation hangs by a thread because of your arrogance." Stuart swallowed hard, humiliation burning his throat. He wanted to argue, to insist it wasn't his fault, but the words lodged in his chest. That night, lying awake beside Clara's rigid form, he stared at the ceiling and realized the truth. His downfall had begun not on the day Keely walked out of their marriage, but on the day he underestimated her strength. For Keely, though, strength had become her quiet companion. She no longer feared the whispers. She no longer dreaded the comparisons. She lived, day by day, in the small joys of motherhood, in the laughter of the twins, in the steady love of Patrick. One evening, sitting by the fire with Patrick's arm around her, she whispered, "Do you think he hates me now?" Patrick considered. "No. He hates himself. For losing you. For underestimating you. And for realizing too late that the life he built is hollow compared to the one you've created." Keely leaned her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. For the first time in years, she felt no bitterness, no anger, no need for revenge. She had already won, and that victory, unlike Stuart's fleeting triumphs, could never be taken away. But victories cast shadows. For Stuart, every courtroom became heavier, every client more skeptical, every dinner invitation laced with pity. Clara's resentment hardened into contempt, and the whispers in Edinburgh society grew sharper. Bowman? Oh, the one whose ex-wife eclipsed him? Yes, tragic, really. He might have had a career. Might have. And for Stuart, that was the cruelest cut of all. Because Keely hadn't just walked into his wedding. She had walked into history. And she had left him stranded in the wreckage of his own ambition. The Whitcomb townhouse in Edinburgh had been built to impress. Marble foyers, gilded mirrors, and chandeliers that sparkled even on the gloomiest Scottish day. But by late November 2023, the grandeur only magnified the silence inside. Clara sat at her dressing table, brushing her hair with long, sharp strokes. The mirror reflected her face, still beautiful, still immaculate, but the eyes staring back were shadowed, brittle. Behind her, Stuart leaned against the doorway, tie loosened, his jaw clenched. "You've barely spoken to me in a week," he said finally. Clara didn't pause the brush. "What is there to say?" "That you forgive me." She laughed bitterly, the sound sharp. "Forgive you? Stuart, you didn't just ruin a wedding, you ruined my standing." Do you know what it's like to walk into a luncheon and feel every eye on you, not for admiration but pity? Stuart's fists tightened. I didn't ask her to steal the spotlight. She didn't steal it, Clara snapped, spinning in her chair to face him. You handed it to her. You invited her. You gave her the stage, and she walked in with more grace than I could muster even if I spent a lifetime trying. The words struck harder than any blow. Stuart opened his mouth, but nothing came. Clara's eyes softened, but only slightly. You still look at her, she whispered. I saw it. During the vows. The way your eyes drifted. You might not love her, Stuart, but you can't let her go. And that's worse. She turned back to her mirror, resuming her brush strokes. Stuart stood there a moment longer, the weight of her words pressing down until he could barely breathe. Then he walked out, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the cold, empty hall. Across the sea in Dublin, Keely's world was far noisier. The twins tumbled across the living room rug, building towers of blocks and then knocking them down with triumphant shouts. Keely sat on the sofa, one hand pressed to her swollen belly, the other flipping through a picture book as Oliver demanded she, "Read again, Mummy, read again." Patrick entered, phone in hand, his expression wry. You'll laugh at this, he said, tossing the phone onto the sofa beside her. Keely glanced at the screen. It was a tabloid cover, a grainy photo of her pushing a trolley in Tesco, hair tied back, wearing Patrick's oversized hoodie. The headline screamed, "From billionaire's belle to shopping in aisles, Keely McKee keeps it real." She groaned. Do they really need to document my groceries? Patrick chuckled, scooping James into his arms. At least they said you keep it real. Could be worse. They could have said you're carrying quintuplets. Keely laughed, though her chest ached with unease. The attention was relentless. She had not chosen this spotlight, yet it followed her like a shadow. Every step outside brought cameras. Every social media post from a bystander turned into gossip. Late at night, when the house was quiet and the boys finally asleep, she confessed it to Patrick. Sometimes I feel like I'm not living my life anymore. I'm performing it. Patrick cupped her face gently. Then we stop performing. We build walls where we need them. The press doesn't get to own you. I do. The boys do. You own yourself. She smiled, pressing her forehead against his. You always make it sound so simple. Because it is, he murmured. Love is simple. It's people who make it complicated. Back in Edinburgh, Stuart's complications multiplied. The fallout from the wedding hadn't passed. It had festered. Clients grew wary, whispers about his judgment spread in the courts, and a key donor quietly withdrew his support for Stuart's parliamentary ambitions. His carefully polished reputation had been chipped, and each crack spread wider by the day. At a charity gala in December, Stuart and Clara made their first public appearance since the wedding. Clara wore emerald silk, her smile painted on like armor. Stuart stood tall, forcing charm into his voice as he greeted old colleagues. But the whispers never stopped. That's him, isn't it? Bowman? Yes, the one whose ex-wife married McKee. Did you see the photos? She looked radiant. Clara must be furious. Stuart felt the weight of every glance, every half-hidden smirk. He excused himself to the bar, downing a scotch in one swallow. His reflection in the glass looked older, worn, the sharp lines of his ambition dulled by failure. When he returned to Clara's side, she was speaking to a group of women, her laughter too sharp, her gestures too forced. Their eyes flicked to him, then away, as though he were already irrelevant. That night, Clara didn't speak to him in the car. She didn't speak to him as they undressed, or as they slid into bed. The silence was louder than any accusation. Meanwhile, Keely's pregnancy progressed. By Christmas, she was radiant, her belly full and round beneath a soft red dress as she stood beside Patrick at their annual foundation gala. The twins, dressed in matching suits, handed out candy canes to guests, eliciting coos and laughter. Keely gave a short speech, her voice steady despite the cameras. She spoke not of herself, but of the hospitals their foundation supported, of the nurses and doctors who needed resources, of the patients who deserved dignity. When she finished, the applause was genuine, heartfelt. Patrick kissed her cheek, whispering, "You were perfect." Later that night, as snow fell outside their townhouse, Keely tucked the twins into bed and lingered by the window, watching the flakes drift. Patrick wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, his hands warm against her skin. "You looked like you belonged up there," he said softly. Keely shook her head. "I still feel like the girl scrubbing cafe counters." "And that's why they love you," he replied. "Because you never forgot who you were." She leaned into him, tears pricking her eyes. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe it, that maybe she had earned this happiness, not stumbled into it by accident. But in Edinburgh, happiness was in short supply. By New Year's, Clara's resentment had curdled into something darker. She scrutinized Stuart constantly, searching his face for signs of longing when Keely's name appeared in the papers. She accused him of lingering on Keely's photos, of secretly regretting the divorce. "You wanted her here," Clara spat one night after catching him reading yet another headline. "You wanted her to shine, so you could feel something again. Admit it!" Stuart slammed the paper down. "I wanted to crush her, to prove she was nothing without me." Clara's laughter was cruel. "And instead, you proved you're nothing without her." The words cut deep. Stuart turned away, but they clung like poison. By January 2024, Keely was nearing her due date. She spent mornings curled on the sofa with the twins, afternoons walking the gardens with Patrick, and evenings preparing tiny clothes for the babies soon to come. Yet even in her joy, doubts whispered. Could she handle 4 children? Could she balance motherhood with the constant public attention? Would she be enough? For them, for Patrick, for herself? One night, as she sat rocking Oliver after a nightmare, he whispered sleepily, "Mummy, you won't leave us, will you? Like Daddy left?" Keely's heart broke. She kissed his forehead fiercely. "Never, sweetheart. Never." When she returned to bed, tears still streaking her cheeks, Patrick pulled her close. She told him what Oliver had said, her voice trembling. Patrick's embrace tightened. "Then we make sure they always know we're here. Together. No matter what." Keely nodded, her heart aching with both sorrow and hope. For her, the future wasn't about eclipsing Stuart anymore. It was about building something real, something lasting, a family that would never question their worth. In Edinburgh, Stuart stood in the empty hall of his chambers, staring out at the rain-slicked streets. His reflection in the window looked like a stranger, haunted, hollow. His ambition had once seemed boundless. Now it felt like quicksand, dragging him down with every step. Keely had walked into his wedding and left him in ruins, and though he tried to tell himself it was her fault, her audacity, her arrogance, the truth gnawed at him. It had been his choice, his invitation, his downfall, and Clara's words rang in his ears. "You're nothing without her." By spring, Keely would give birth, her family expanding, her joy deepening. By spring, Stuart would face choices that could not be undone. 2 lives, once intertwined, now diverged completely, and fate, patient and merciless, was not finished with either of them. The night of March 18th, 2024, the McKee townhouse in Dublin was alive with urgency. Keely clutched Patrick's hand, her face pale but resolute, as the contractions gripped her like waves pulling her under. The twins had been tucked safely with Patrick's sister earlier that evening, but Keely had known, long before the midwife confirmed it, that the babies were coming tonight. Patrick guided her into the waiting car, his face taut with both worry and excitement. "Breathe, Key," he murmured, his arm around her shoulders. "Just breathe." "I am breathing," she shot back through clenched teeth, then winced as another contraction seized her. Despite the pain, she laughed breathlessly. "Don't tell me what to do." Patrick smiled, brushing sweat-damp curls from her face. "Fair enough, love. You tell me what to do." By the time they arrived at the maternity ward, Keely was trembling, her grip on Patrick's hand so tight his knuckles whitened. Nurses swirled around them, efficient and calm. But it was Patrick's steady presence that anchored her as the hours bled into dawn. At 5:42 a.m., their daughter was born, her cry sharp and strong. Keely wept, clutching the tiny bundle to her chest. "She's perfect," she whispered, kissing the baby's soft head. At 5:59 a.m., her son followed, smaller, quieter, but healthy. Patrick kissed Keely's forehead, tears glistening in his own eyes. "Twins again," he whispered in awe. "The universe must really trust us." Keely laughed weakly, exhaustion tugging at her, but her heart soared. She gazed at her children, two perfect lives that would never know the loneliness she had once carried. "We'll never let them down," she said softly. "We'll give them everything. Not the money, not the houses. Us. That's what matters." Patrick pressed his forehead to hers, his voice breaking. "Always." While Keely cradled her newborns in Dublin, Stuart sat alone in the dark of his Edinburgh study, a bottle of scotch half drained at his elbow. His career, once gilded with promise, now sagged under the weight of gossip and doubt. The Whitcombs had begun withdrawing their support entirely. Whispers in Parliament grew louder, questioning his judgment, his stability. The newspaper in his lap showed Keely and Patrick at their foundation gala weeks earlier. Keely radiant in a sapphire gown, her belly prominent, her smile serene. The caption read, "Keely McKee, a new chapter of motherhood and philanthropy." Stuart's thumb brushed over the photo, a bitter laugh escaping him. She had become the woman society adored, while he was reduced to a cautionary tale. The door creaked open. Clara stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her face pale with disdain. "You're drinking again," she said flatly. "Better than listening to you," he muttered. Clara stepped forward, her heels clicking against the hardwood. "Do you know what they call you now? Behind closed doors?" Stuart didn't look up. "The man who invited his own ruin." The word struck him like a slap. Clara's lips twisted. "They're not wrong. You handed her the crown, and you're too weak to take it back." Stuart surged to his feet, fury in his eyes. "Don't speak of her!" Clara flinched but didn't back down. "Why not? She's the ghost between us. She's the one you still think of when you think no one's watching. I married a man obsessed with his failure, and his failure wears her face." Her voice broke on the last word, and she turned sharply, slamming the door behind her. Stuart stood trembling in the silence, the scotch burning in his throat, the headlines flashing in his mind. The man who invited his own ruin. The phrase would haunt him long after Clara's footsteps faded. In Dublin, Keely's hospital room was quiet, save for the soft breaths of her newborns. Oliver and James crept in, holding Patrick's hands, their eyes wide with wonder as they approached the bassinets. "They're so tiny," Oliver whispered. "Were we that tiny?" James asked. Keely smiled, tears filling her eyes. "Yes, and now look at you, my big boys." The twins leaned close, peering at their new siblings. James reached out, brushing a finger against his brother's fist. The baby curled his hand instinctively, and James gasped, his face breaking into a grin. "He likes me," James whispered proudly. Keely's heart swelled. Patrick lifted Oliver onto the bed, settling him beside Keely. Oliver laid his head against her arm, gazing at the babies with awe. In that moment, Keely felt a completeness she had never imagined possible. The shadows of the past, the divorce, the loneliness, the humiliation, faded into the background. She had built something new, something unshakable. Later, as the room quieted, Patrick sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders. "Do you realize what today is?" he asked softly. Keely shook her head. "Today's the anniversary of the day we met. March 18th, 2022. The spilled champagne, remember?" Keely laughed, her exhaustion giving way to warmth. "Of course I remember. My clumsiest moment." "And the best one," Patrick said firmly. He kissed her temple. "2 years later, we've got 4 children and a lifetime ahead of us. Fate knew what it was doing." Keely pressed her forehead against his, whispering, "For once, I believe that." In Edinburgh, Stuart stumbled through his days like a ghost. Clara avoided him, society ignored him, and his career withered. At a court hearing in April, his opposing counsel made a sly remark about invitations better left unsent, and the chuckles that rippled through the gallery shattered what little composure Stuart had left. That night, he returned home to find Clara gone. A single note lay on the mantel. "I won't live in the shadow of your mistakes. Consider this my last word." The Whitcomb name, the money, the influence, it had all slipped through his fingers. He was left with nothing but empty rooms and the echo of Keely's calm gaze haunting his memory. He poured another glass of scotch, but it no longer numbed him. It only sharpened the truth. The world had moved on, and he had been left behind. For Keely, the months after the twins' birth were full of sleepless nights and overflowing love. She learned to balance feedings with bedtime stories, to comfort 2 crying infants while keeping Oliver and James from knocking over the bassinet in their curiosity. One evening in May, exhausted but glowing, she sat with Patrick on the balcony, both babies cradled in their arms. The city lights glittered below, the air warm with spring. "Do you ever think," Keely murmured, "that all of this is too good to be true?" Patrick kissed the top of her head. "No. I think it's exactly what you deserve." Keely closed her eyes, her heart full. For years, she had believed her life was a cautionary tale. Now she realized it was a testament to survival, to love, to the power of walking into a room and refusing to shrink. And though she didn't dwell on Stuart anymore, sometimes, when the babies slept and the night was still, she wondered if he had found peace, or if he still lived shackled to the ruin he had built with his own hands. In Edinburgh, Stuart sat alone in the dark, the headlines of Keely's new life spread across his desk. "Keely McKee welcomes twins." "Philanthropy grows as McKee family expands." He closed his eyes, the words of Clara echoing in his ears. "You're nothing without her." And for once, he didn't argue, because deep down, he knew she had been right all along. The summer of 2024 arrived early in Dublin, the city basking in long golden evenings that seemed to stretch forever. In the McKee household, laughter rang from every corner, Oliver and James chasing each other through the gardens, the newborns cooing in their bassinets, Patrick calling from the kitchen as he experimented with yet another recipe. Keely stood at the balcony, the warm breeze tugging at her curls. She cradled her daughter against her chest, rocking gently as she gazed out over the city. Below, the street hummed with life, but up here she felt cocooned, safe. She thought of the girl she had been 8 years earlier, the young nurse, exhausted and overlooked, begging for scraps of affection from a man who saw her as ballast. And then she looked at the woman she had become. Mother, partner, philanthropist. She hadn't needed revenge. Life had written it for her. "Penny for your thoughts?" Patrick's voice broke into her reverie. She smiled as he joined her, their son nestled in his arms. "Just thinking how far we've come," she whispered. Patrick leaned in, kissing her temple. "And how far we'll go." Their daughter stirred, sighing contentedly, and Keely felt her heart swell. For the first time in years, her life was not defined by loss or survival. It was defined by love. Meanwhile, in Edinburgh, Stuart's summer was a different story. His chambers had officially cut ties. His name no longer carried weight in political circles. Clara had filed for divorce, her father ensuring that Stuart received nothing of the Whitcomb fortune. His townhouse stood half empty, the silence pressing in like a suffocating fog. But Stuart was not ready to disappear quietly. One humid afternoon in July, he boarded a train to Dublin. He had told no one, not even Charles. In his pocket, a faded photograph of Keely on their wedding day, her smile wide, her eyes bright. He stared at it as the countryside rushed past, his grip so tight the edges crumpled. When he arrived, he lingered outside the McKee townhouse, his collar damp with sweat. Through the open windows he heard laughter, the high-pitched squeals of children, the low rumble of a man's voice, Keely's soft laughter woven between them. He pressed a hand to the iron gate, his chest heaving. This was what he had lost, what he had thrown away, what he had believed he could crush, only to watch it rise higher than ever. For a long moment, he considered knocking. Barging in, demanding to be heard, demanding... what? Forgiveness? Recognition? But the sight of Patrick emerging onto the balcony, Keely beside him, their children in their arms, stopped him cold. They looked untouchable, radiant in their ordinary joy. Stuart's hand fell from the gate. His knees buckled and he sank onto the pavement, his head in his hands. For the first time, he wept. Not for Keely, not for Clara, not even for his lost career. He wept for himself, the boy who had once dreamed of greatness, who had mistaken cruelty for ambition, who had thought love was a stepping stone instead of a sanctuary. He wept because the truth was undeniable. He had not lost Keely. He had lost himself. Inside, Keely sensed none of it. She was too busy soothing her daughter, laughing at Oliver's antics, kissing Patrick's cheek as he teased James about stealing biscuits. Her life was full, so full she no longer carried the shadows of Edinburgh with her. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Patrick gathered the children on the patio. "Family photo," he announced, setting up his phone. The twins groaned, but Keely laughed, corralling them into place. When the shutter clicked, it captured not perfection, but truth. A mother with curls slightly mussed, a father with paint still smudged on his shirt, 4 children wriggling and grinning. Keely looked at the photo later that night, tears in her eyes, not of sorrow, but of gratitude. She had not been erased. She had not been broken. She had risen, not to shame anyone, but to prove, to herself most of all, that she was enough. Back in Edinburgh, Stuart wandered the empty streets until dawn. He returned to his townhouse, the air stale, the rooms echoing. He sat at his desk, pen in hand, and began to write. Not to Clara, not to his colleagues, not even to Keely, to himself. He wrote of ambition and arrogance, of choices made and bridges burned. He wrote of Keely, not as a rival, but as the mirror he had refused to face. He wrote until the sun spilled across the page, until his hand cramped, until there was nothing left to say. And when he set the pen down, he realized the truth. There was no redemption waiting in the wings, no triumphant return, only the slow, painful work of rebuilding, if he ever found the strength to try. Months later, Keely stood in a sunlit hall in Dublin, speaking at a foundation event. Patrick sat in the front row with their children, beaming with pride. She spoke of dignity, of resilience, of the quiet power of surviving what others said you could not. Her words resonated, not just because of her story, but because she spoke them without bitterness, without malice, with grace. When the applause came, it was thunderous. Keely bowed her head, humbled. She thought of the girl she once was, fainting on a bus, unseen and forgotten. She thought of the woman she had become, standing tall, her children's laughter echoing in her ears. And she thought of Stuart, not with anger, but with pity. Because in the end, she had not needed to shame him. He had done that himself. All she had needed to do was survive. And in surviving, she had won everything. The final headline, printed in the Times on December 1st, 2024, captured it best. McKee, From Forgotten Wife to Fearless Mother, A Story of Triumph. And beneath it, a photograph. Keely with Patrick and their 4 children, their smiles brighter than any crown. The caption read simply, "Dignity restored." And for Keely, that was all that mattered.